we've had a very stimulating conference, and now it's time for somebody who is very eloquent to wrap it up and to try and look forward to what we should be doing beyond this conference. We started this conference, of course, with Maria Dunn, our writing and singing troublemaker, and we're going to be ending our conference with another troublemaker. Bryan Palmer is one of Canada's most eminent historians of rebels, particularly people from the working class movements, but not only. He's the editor of Labour Le Travail, which is Canada's leading working class history journal. He's been the editor of that since 1997. Before that, for many years, was the book review editor. And he teaches in the Canadian Studies program at Trent University. And he's the author of many, many books. I'm not going to read the names of the books. I'll just tell you some of the kinds of things that Bryan has written about over the years. He's written about the rebels in Upper Canada. He's written about the Solidarity movement in British Columbia. He's written the definitive working class history of Canada, working class experience. He's written about the radicals in the labor movement, about the labor movement generally in Hamilton, and about the culture of working people. He's written a book called Cultures of Darkness that looks generally at sort of rebellion of various kinds. And he's written a history of the 1960s and all the different kinds of movements of rebellion. So it's my great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, Dr. Bryan Palmer.
Hey. Thanks, Alvin.
And you have both of them out?
I have both of them now. Yeah. Yes, I just have to check I've got everything plugged in here. Well, I want to thank Alvin for that introduction, which I'll definitely fail to live up to. Whenever I come to Alberta, I seem to be surrounded by wonderful, interesting left-wing people. So I think, coming from Ontario, that this notion of Alberta as some kind of backward, retrograde center of all that's wrong in the contemporary world must be just totally some kind of myth created to denigrate all of you people. I can't quite figure it out. I really want to thank the Alberta Labour History Institute for what for me has been a fabulous conference. I go to so many academic conferences which I find tedious and often quite boring, and I have not been bored here at all. I have learned a great deal, and I've been very excited by what I've heard. I, for instance, as a labor historian, knew about the attack on the building trades in Alberta in the 1980s, but I knew nothing about this dandelion movement, which I found, absolutely fascinating to hear about. And I think this conference, which has been so good, is really clearly the tip of the iceberg of the excellent work that the Alberta Labour History Institute has been doing. A portion of which we saw yesterday. I mean, I think it far exceeds, to the best of my knowledge, any work of this kind that's being done in any other province in the country. So you really, you have an excellent body of people here. And, Dave Werlin, who's the, president and the kind of spearhead behind this, I think, has just put together a wonderful group of people that's done phenomenally good work. So my hat is off to all of you. What I really want to do here is try to frame my remarks around a statement which was made in the video we saw yesterday, and in terms of the workplace struggle against asbestos, where one of the workers said, "We stood up on principle, and that's what the labor movement is all about." And indeed, I want to talk a bit about that and frame my remarks around that. And principles not just of a fair day's wage for a fair day's work, but principles of social justice, of fundamental rights to be free of all oppressions, These kinds of principles have animated the workers' movement that for almost 2 centuries has harbored recognition of the way in which capitalism's violence, its dependence and inevitable promulgation of crises, and its necessity of routinely driving down the living standards of working people has been the context in which the labor movement arose and working people have mounted resistances of all kinds. And it's for this reason that on the left, the principle and the sort of animating sort of motivation for resistance has been not just a fair day's work for a fair day's wage, but indeed abolition of the wage system, abolition of the wage system. And the stories and memories and histories that we've heard about in this conference have in some senses resonated around the necessity of precisely that kind of action. And they are a resource to draw upon, but also, I think, a legacy and really a prod to push us in further directions. I think the conference was really wonderfully introduced by Betsy Jameson's moving account of her own journey on becoming an historian. And many of us have our stories, similar kinds, of different kinds, of how we came to be an historian and how we came to sort of embrace, as people on the left and people committed to the labor movement, the study of workers in the past. But I think few of us have done as much as Betsy to recover and bring back what she, in quoting, I think it was Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, designated the faceless, soundless voices of those tragically invisible men and women and children who have paid so dearly as sources of capitalist accumulation over their lives. Betsy's account of her engagement with the history and the meaning of the Ludlow massacre put names, faces, voices, and most of all, importantly, I think, meanings to the coerced sacrifices and heroic resistance that has long characterized working class life. And it was just I think, and I know I speak for all the people in the room, that it was really a wonderful introduction to this conference. This same set of meanings and recoveries has emerged in the conference as well in the story circles. I was only able to attend some because I couldn't be in 2 places at once, but really the story circle around Alberta's hot summer of 1986 was brought back to life by Gord Christie, Vicky Beauchamp, and others. And it featured as well in Paul Moist's keynote address that harkened back to the vision of labor activists in the era of the Winnipeg General Strike. And apprenticing labor historians like Andrea Samuel and Jason Devine and Peter Graham provided as well wonderful and complementary accounts of the Gainers' Strike, of struggles for health and safety in the mining sector, and of socialist visionaries. While more established academic authors such as David Bright and Tom Langford and Cindy Locke-Drake revisited the sources, the oral histories, and the complexities of understanding critical components of Alberta's labor past. It's difficult, really, not to be humbled before this record of working class resistance and survival. Since the early 19th century and before, capital and the state have pressed hard their iron heel of repression, bringing this boot down on the collective throat of working people. Small wonder that so many voices have been silenced and so many faces shadowed and obscured. Yet there have always been those who have insisted, as Paul Moist told us, that the great appear great to us because we are on our knees. And let us rise. Let us rise. But how do we rise? The recollections have brought forward a variety of means and ways. The session on the story circles around the Dandelion movement, around public sector workers, around health and safety struggles, around the Gainers and other strikes of the hot summer of 1986, all of these tell us how people have been rising, and constantly so, against innumerable odds, and swimming against a variety of very difficult and often torrid streams, which seem in more recent times to have grown in intensity, grown in antagonism, grown in hostility, to the point that, the virulent hatred of working class people often drips from the public podiums, the mass media outlets, and the sort of cultural industries of our time. Well, Betsy's acutely diplomatic statement that she isn't about to tell any union except her own how to engage in the struggle, and that she's an advocate of listening rather than telling, this is good advice for any academic. Unfortunately, I've been asked to violate it by providing some kind of, statement of, where we're supposed to go. So while I'm singing her praises, I'm also saying she got off rather easy there in that first session. And what I really want to do is provide, and I mean this quite sincerely, a perspective on future visions for the labor movement, but one that I provide with some humility. I mean, my voice may sound forceful, but my convictions are not necessarily so. But I do think that we have been, in some senses, many ways, silenced by the political economy of the last 40 years, which has put the labor movement on such such a defensiveness that many of us who are its advocates often feel silenced in our capacity to criticize our movement, which it really needs to be seen, I believe that strongly, as our movement. And, just a brief story of myself, one anecdote. A very formative moment for me politically was 1983 in British Columbia, which at that time saw what for me and many in my generation was one of the most widespread mobilizations of working class resistance to a state-orchestrated assault on all the dispossessed in the province. BC did what Milton Friedman said should be done. He said, don't do it piecemeal, a piece of legislation here, a thwack there, a sort of police maneuver here. He said, get it all in, go all in. And that's what the Socrate government did with a massive legislative assault on working people. And quite frankly, it was a heroic moment of resistance, but it was also a tragic denouement of defeat, in which I'll speak a bit about later as well. But I do remember that when Jack Monroe was pictured on television, he was the head of the IWA in British Columbia at that time, shaking hands with Bill Bennett and ending what had looked like was going to be a general strike that was proclaimed for the next day. There were many gatherings, and I was at a large one, where there was a lot of denunciation of what Monroe had done. And I was one of a number of people who were quite outspoken in our criticisms of what had been done. And this is by way of explaining why I'm going to put forward some program. I was asked to go on national television and debate Monroe and Jim Matkin, who was then the head of the Employers Association of British Columbia. I said, well, I can't really do that. I'm going to get a person from the labor movement to go in there, because they will just see me as some pinko egghead, who can be easily dismissed, and Monroe will run with that, and so will Matkin, which would have been, there was truth to that. And I thought it'll be no problem, because I was in a room last night with 60, 70 people, all of them labor movement figures, who were denouncing what had happened. Well, I spent the next day on the phone, and could I get anybody to go on? I finally got a guy who I'd worked with in the peace movement, who was the head of the bus drivers union, which was not in the BC Federation of Labor. They were outside of it. And he said, oh, okay, I'll go on. And then he went on and soft-pedaled it. And from that, if I often appear outspoken, it's because I kind of thought, well, that was a moment that passed me by, and I should have been speaking out against what happened. So I'll try to do what I've been asked to do, and I'll throw out some suggestions, which I think are based on a reasoned and informed sense of the current realities that the labor movement faces. Now, I don't need to spend a lot of time running through, I think, the travails that the labor movement has found itself in over the last 4 decades. But union density has dropped decidedly, 31% in Canada and plummeting further. The end of the post-war settlement, which has essentially been torn up by capital and the state, well documented in Leo Panitch and Donald Schwartz's book, Assault on Trade Union Freedoms, which, as we've seen with recent legislation in terms of, you know, the back-to-work sort of protocols of the Harper government, has basically defined any work area as an essential service. We are truly in a state of what Panitch and Schwartz called permanent exceptionalism. That is, you have certain trade union rights, except they're going to be decided to be exceptional and dispensed with. I love this button. You can't jail the strike. And in 1986, it actually, you know, it had a ring of truth about it. As, you know, we saw those images and saw that film on the Gaynor strike. You couldn't jail the strike. As, you know, Dave Werlin said, there aren't enough jail cells, there aren't enough police, there aren't enough lawyers. The state isn't powerful enough to put us all behind bars for defending basic working class rights. The sad reality is that in 2012, it's harder to wear the button and think that that's true. It's more difficult to kind of stand that ground. I think it still needs, obviously, to be stood. I'm not saying, you know, we can't have the same kind of fight. But the way in which this sense that you can't jail the strike has been eroded by decades of, you know, state initiatives and capital's recalcitrance is, I think, obvious. And this has created this context of really a 40-year downturn in some senses in the fortunes of the trade union movement, has fed the ideology of anti-trade unionism and even, as I said, virulent hatred of the working class that kind of spews itself out in all kinds of, you know, venues. This is reflected in the political arena, where a shift to the right in mainstream electoral politics really means that we do not have anything approximating a Labour Party, let alone a Socialist Party, operating in the political mainstream, which is supposedly a part of the defining feature of Canada's differentiation, for instance, from you know, other countries such as the United States. And as well, feeding this process has been not just the demise of the trade union movement, but the withering and collapse for a whole series of reasons of the organized revolutionary left, which I would argue is at its weakest stage in Canada for any point in really the last 125 years. I mean, the left was much, much stronger in times when trade union entitlements were actually much weaker. So it is not a good time for the trade union movement, and it is not a good time for the left. How to rise? I think that while I'm going to start conceptually, I think a fundamental premise for a labor movement intent on reviving itself, and for all those who support that revival, is reconceptualizing the very understanding of what it means to be a worker and what labor is. A word that I don't think we've ever heard in the conference in 2 days comes out of my favorite century, the 19th century, although it goes much further back to Roman times, and that's proletariat. We never heard that term, which is a term very much associated with the Marxist tradition. But it's important to note that proletarian did not mean wage labor, which it came to mean with capitalism's development. What it meant was a person dispossessed. A person dispossessed. The fundamental organizing premise of the trade union movement has always been an injury to one is an injury to all. And what I'm suggesting is that the labor movement needs to reconceptualize its understanding of labor not as wage workers, but as the dispossessed. And as it identifies dispossession as where it stands in its struggles on a day-to-day basis, it will inevitably find itself in common cause with indigenous peoples, with women, with students, with the unemployed, with the poor, with the criminalized. And labor then, in this redefinition of itself as a defender of the dispossessed and an advocate of the dispossessed, should do so not with some understanding that it's a senior partner, but rather understanding that it is, in some senses, the labor movement, the most powerful element of the dispossessed that actually has the obligation to give the most, to give back to the struggles so much. So again, how to rise? I think we also need to reconsider where the labor movement has been historically and where it is now. If we look historically at the labor movement in Canada and we designate certain dates that represent breakthroughs in which the labor movement kind of advanced, I would just throw out arbitrarily dates like 1886, 1919, 1946, 1968. And each of those dates I would associate with what has historically been a great project of the labor movement, organizing the unorganized. To take the last two dates, 1946 would represent the organization of mass production workers and the beginnings of, the modern trade union movement, the movement away from craft unionism towards organizing the semi-skilled and the unskilled in a lot of different sectors. And 1968 would be sort of on the harbinger of the organization of the public sector. But when we see the labor movement and its history in that way, I think what we see is that it really hasn't been since the 1960s that the labor movement has had an historic breakthrough premised on organizing the unorganized. Now, what I'm going to say in what follows is not to suggest that the labor movement stopped trying to organize the unorganized. I still think that's pivotal. That's obviously work that must be done. And I'd suggest that all of the work that the labor movement has done again, needs to be continued, needs to be deepened, needs to be extended. But what I'm going to suggest is perhaps the necessity of grasping that it may be difficult to conceive that breakthroughs for the labor movement of the kind achieved in the 1940s and the 1960s can be replicated in our times by organizing the unorganized. There may have been a wall that's been reached, and there may be, I'm not saying that new sectors can't be organized, but I'm saying that even organizing those unorganized new sectors won't necessarily push the labor movement into a qualitatively new advance, the way past organizational advances did. What I'm going to suggest is the way that the labor movement can advance and can achieve new breakthroughs is actually to politicize itself. In other words, the next breakthrough may not be about organizing the unorganized, but in fact politicizing the labor movement so that it actually addresses the dispossessed in broad ways. The labor movement, as one of the figures in the Dandelion story circle suggested, needs an aggressive change. The politics of labor are long overdue for such an aggressive change. At the heart, I think, of this new politicization is a conceptual change, understanding dispossession as where the labor movement needs to cast its energies, where it needs to put its commitments. And in fact, that means, in some senses, breaking from what was, in some ways, a function of that post-World War II accord in terms of the understanding of politics, where the labor movement essentially said, okay, we look after our members' bargaining rights, and we cede to what was then the CCF the sort of franchise for looking after labor's rights in the political arena. What I'm suggesting is it's time to rethink that bargain and to rethink the notion of where the politics of labor may be, and to push for an expanding conception of political activism and an expanding notion, and to move away from, and an expanding notion of independent labor action. An injury to one is an injury to all. What this means is that the workers' movement and the labor movement needs to make common cause on a more political basis and a more independent basis with indigenous peoples, with women, with ethnic and racialized minorities, with students, with the unemployed. Independent politics need to be fostered in unions by the formation of political action committees. This needs to fight against both the apathy of significant sectors of the membership, as well as against elements in the union leadership and the NDP, which will fight tooth and nail, I think, against this kind of independent political project. The whole question of politics on an independent foundation needs to be given a space in the labor movement, and the labor movement needs to give new spaces outside of itself to the growth of the left and to the sort of alliance, and to support for and absolute work with other groups. I mean, when this young man in the back said, well, a constant issue in this conference has been, how is youth attracted? And he said, well, and it was being posed as, how are young members of the unions going to be drawn into union work? That's important. That's an important work. But he put, actually, I think, he hit the nail right on the head when he said, what we need is for the labor movement to actually align with youth movements and with movements of indigenous people and with the women's movement and with other groups. Trade unions must put their power, their resources, their presence behind more than individual dues-paying members. They must step outside of the notion, without abandoning it, that collective bargaining is the sole measure of their being and existence. They must work with and not stifle a left, which must be organized parallel to the union movement as well as embedded within it. Strikes, of course, must draw broad numbers to picket lines, and the labor movement must be on marches with students, with women, with all of those who resist global capital. That happens. It's there. And the sort of slogan, educate, agitate, and organize, has been put into practice, but often in ways which sees the labor movement join other forces of resistance rather than insist that educating, agitating, and organizing apply not just to trade union members, but to all of the dispossessed. And in this sense, politics will not be confined to electoral contests. A politics of labor must embrace a generalized endorsement of struggles, all of which, if they are significant, will indeed be class struggles as well, and all of which will address fundamental issues of dispossession. As Don Cole said, resist, fight, be in the streets. But I'm saying do so with a politics of engagement that embraces not just all trade union members, but also all elements of the dispossessed. Use rank-and-file political action committees to push union leaders to the left. Embrace not stifle the left in your midst. Allow for debate, discussion, even disagreement on the left within unions. Bargain, yes, but educate and agitate around wider issues. And also have a protracted view. Losing a particular struggle is not a defeat as long as the dispossessed have been defended, unions have been strengthened, Their agendas have been extended, and struggles have been broadened. Now, this is the essence, for instance, in Don Cole's suggestion of thinking outside the box. Create a new labor leadership that can work in provincial centrals and in the CLC, and that will indeed embrace the notion that an injury to one is an injury to all. Create new structures of possibility, new sensibilities, new visions. For all the old structures, the old agendas, the old practices, these aren't working. Take a leaf from Alberta's dandelion movement. Insist that we are not going to go away. We are not going to be killed off. We are not tending to our narrow patch of ground and our own particularistic gardens. To those that say this is a utopian and foolhardy agenda, it has to be pointed out that this is actually quite a modest proposal compared to the vision and uphill fights of workers who had no rights in the 19th century and who built the foundations on which the 20th century labor movement developed and evolved. Things look bleak in 2012, but they looked much bleaker in 1874, in 1894, in 1914, and in 1934. We can't let the legacy of those workers who struggled to build a better world in times much worse than ours be basically defeated and pushed to the side. We owe a debt to our past and those who made it. And we owe our children a better future than they face now, which is, dismally bleak. Brother Cole spoke, for instance, of a coalition. And this may be a way of conceiving the politics I am suggesting. But I would actually push perhaps the envelope of left politics and argue that coalitions, as they have been practiced and conceived of in the labor movement, are not really the way to go in terms of the politics I'm trying to suggest. Precisely because coalitions tend to institutionalize the hiving off of the dispossessed into specific interest group organizations. And we know that when that happens, the labor unions will be the strongest of the weak, for they are really the strongest of the dispossessed. But they must see themselves then having the responsibility to use that strength broadly rather than to preserve it in their own sort of interests. I remember, as I said, the Solidarity Coalition in BC in 1983. Labor unions led the way, not in the original sort of springing forward of the Lower Mainland Solidarity Coalition, but in turning that movement, which was composed of women's organizations, organizations of the disabled, organizations of anti-poverty activists, etc. Those groups created the Lower Mainland Solidarity Coalition, which was then welded into a powerful force, the Solidarity Coalition, by the trade union leadership at the helm of the BC Federation of Labor. They welded it together into a formidable resistance. For a time, the greatest mobilization in modern British Columbia had the province really on the brink of a promised general strike. The coalition seemed to be fighting to win. And then on the eve of this momentous class struggle, the coalition was usurped as Jack Monroe flew to Kelowna alone to negotiate a curt and ugly end to all of it. Coalitions then are only as strong as their mutualism in a meaningful sense. And that is what the politics of labor must make newer and more concrete, that mutualism is real. It isn't really just premised on the power, which is considerable, of the labor movement. And I believe that only left caucuses in the unions, connected to and orchestrated to an organized left outside the unions, and working in other sectors, can offer an alternative politics that opens out into a new politicized unionism that actually engages with and develops the politics of the dispossessed. The principle that the labor movement must stand on its current ground is that resistance to all dispossession is its political project. An injury to one is an injury to all. We need a labor movement that fights to win all battles on the basis of this. Trade unions' founding principle needs to be brought back to trade unionism and extended to the dispossessed as a whole. It is a difficult project, and one that I believe will be waged primarily from below, but it is perhaps the only way the workers' movement can rise to where it belongs, to become a beacon for all of the dispossessed, a tribune for all people, and indeed to create a society free of the dispossession that capitalism has for so long thrived upon, deepened, and extended. Thank you very much.